The other part is a lot more difficult. It's easy to make a piano that sounds like Nancarrow's. The technology exists now. The trick is thinking, what would Nancarrow do if not, he didn't have a player piano now, because even a player piano has limitations. What would he do if he had a sequencer, if he had a computer that can play as fast as you like, making the capabilities of the player piano pale in comparison? Well, one thing that Nancarrow always had a little bit of frustration with was acceleration. It's very hard to control acceleration on the player piano. If you think about what Nancarrow had to do, he would have to, on his roll of paper, before he began, what he would ordinarily do is draw lines before he made any punches at all. And the lines would represent the shortest, fastest sound that he had. And so his whole paper would be covered by these minute lines. But if he has an acceleration piece that gets faster and faster as it goes along, you can't have this even grid. It's very, very hard to make it so the lines decrease evenly in length as the piece goes faster. It's just technically and physically a very, very difficult thing to get precise. But for a computer, if you tell it, I want you to be 10 times faster at the end than you were at the beginning, it can do so in a moment. Whereas it would take Nancarrow again months to write these pieces. So for the piece that I wrote in the style of Nancarrow, I decided to make it a piece of constant acceleration. From the beginning to the end, except for the very, very end, the piece never stops getting faster. But it gets faster in a kind of unique way that I hope that Nancarrow would appreciate. The piece is basically in 3 sections. The first section is kind of like the barber poles you'd see outside on 72nd Street that always spin around and seem like they're going down, but never really get anywhere. They give you the illusion of going down, but they don't actually move down. So the first part of the piece is this kind of oral illusion barber pole in which you have a melody that's always going down, but it never quite gets off the bottom of the piano. And the reason that happens is that as the melody gets lower, it gets softer. And it comes in again at the top. Again, very, very soft. And it's only loud or at a comfortable volume when it's right at the middle of its volume range. So you stop noticing the melody as it gets lower, and instead, it's already come in from above, and you have this effect in which the melody is always seeming to descend, but never getting anywhere. That's the first section of the piece. This is the melody used. It's a quirky little melody of 12 notes that Nancarrow wouldn't have used because serialism wasn't quite around when he began his player piano. Well, it's not true. Serialism had been invented, but Nancarrow was in Mexico. So this uses all 12 notes of the chromatic scale. And on that 13th note, we've ended 1 note lower than we began. So if the melody continued, we would just keep going out of the range of the piano eventually. But the beginning of the piece is all about maintaining the illusion that that melody is descending while not actually letting it get any lower. In the second part, second section of the piece, at first this process continues. But as I said, the melody has 12 notes in it. And every time one individual note happens, it starts getting pulled out and put somewhere else, higher up on the piano. So every time that middle note happens, for instance, it'll get pulled out of the pattern and put higher up. And then, the same thing happens for 2 notes of the 12 notes. This one gets pulled out, and that one gets pulled out. So you have the melody, you can still hear it, but there's 2 notes missing, and they're somewhere else instead, here and here, for instance. And then 3 notes, and maybe that 3rd note gets pulled out and put low on the piano. And then 4 notes, and 5, until suddenly all 12 notes are pulled out and put in their own places on the piano, so that instead of a melody, you just have a cloud of seemingly unrelated notes. So the pattern of notes, first we have the melody, but every time, let's say this note happens, we go and be pulled out up there. The cloud that eventually gets pulled up is this following chord. It's kind of a bluesy chord that Nancarrow probably would have incorporated into his pieces. Still all 12 notes, but now instead of being melodic, they've been pulled out over the course of the register of the piano. So you get a cloud of notes that's now totally unrecognizably related to this initial melody. What happens in the third part is that as this has been happening, the piece has been accelerating constantly. The acceleration is very, very clear in the beginning because it's a melody, so you can hear a melody getting faster. But once it's this cloud of notes, it's very, very hard to know that the piece is actually getting faster because they're not connected to anything. Like we talked about like a movie in the beginning, it's easy to hear something going faster if it's clearly related. It's much harder to hear as it's separated out. But as it gets faster and faster and faster and faster, the cloud is basically getting narrower and narrower and narrower and narrower. So it's almost like it's happening all at once. So at first it's happening like this, and as it gets narrower, it's happening like this, and eventually this cloud of notes is happening so fast that they're almost all happening at the same time. But once they start happening at the same time, the cloud, the whole cloud starts doing the same process as happened in the beginning. So it starts going like this, and by the end, it's gone so fast that the whole thing is doing what the individual melody is doing in the beginning. So instead of, I don't have 12 spread out fingers to play the whole thing, but instead of moving all the way up and down the piano as a cloud moving at the same time, and you can begin to hear it. At first it's very, very difficult to notice. All you can hear is that something strange is happening. It's going really fast, the notes are changing. But as it gets faster and faster and faster, it becomes more and more like what was at the beginning, because it becomes more like a single unit again. And that's, I should label that as the third section of the piece. Now what I'll do is, and 3 at the end, it goes back to 1. At the outset, the piece is at its beginning tempo, and right before the end, it's gone to 10 times its speed. Now this is something that would have been difficult on Nancarrow's player piano even by itself. But the effect with the computer is that it's what's known as a fractal. A fractal is a scenario in which, when you look very closely at something, like a leaf on a tree, it has a certain form. And when you zoom out and look at the whole thing from a distant perspective, the whole itself has the same form. So in the beginning, you're looking very closely at a single melody, and as the piece gets faster and faster, you're effectively zooming out until the entire section that was that first part is seen to be in the same form as the original. So let's demonstrate that orally now through the piece. And this piece is using the modification of piano technology to imitate Nancarrow's piano that I was talking about when I was demonstrating the individual notes earlier. So like Nancarrow's pieces, it pulls in from a variety of traditions to do something using only one technique. There's no harmony in this entire piece. It's only this one melody. Any sound of harmony, any sound of it, there's no real simultaneity is created by just the pure acceleration of that single line being spread out, and then the spreading out going so fast that you can once again hear the single line within the original component. That's the kind of emergent property that Nancarrow is searching for and using his player pianos to create, taking into account the etudes, what he can push the limits of the instrument, the compositional etude, how can he use that technique to create new aural effects, counterpoint, how he can combine many lines at once to create effects that are more than the sum of their parts, to combine aspects like the blues and jazz with rich harmonies and complicated rhythms and a kind of improvisatory flair, as well as his own kind of quirky humor. It was always a winking at his audience, like, look what I can do with my instrument, look what I can do with the player piano. I don't need to worry if no one can play this anymore, I have the perfect performer for me. So Nancarrow wrote about 50 player piano works, and then eventually came back to writing instrumental music. But it was really in his player piano studies that he was able to let his mind wander. So I suppose we can be thankful that people were not able to play his music originally, as troubling as that was for him. It forced him to engage with an entirely new compositional medium years and years and years before computers would be able to do similar sorts of things. So this was a lecture on the counterpoint of traditions in the music of Conlon Nancarrow, culminating in what I hope would have been a piece not in the style of Nancarrow, but as a kind of homage to Nancarrow, using his ideas and using techniques that he didn't have available at the time of his own composition, but expanding upon them with the possibilities of computerized technology. Are there any questions? Well then, thank you all for coming.